Good morning and happy Sabbath, church. Thanks for joining us online this morning. Just a few announcements before we begin. We've set a date for our church reopening with an asterisk, really. There's a lot of things that have to go into play in a church reopening. We've been in conversations every week about how we are going to go about doing this. But we've set a date for July 4th. By this point, you should have already received an email with a letter kind of describing some of the things that you can look forward to in anticipation of our reopening. Church is going to look different starting July 4th, and so you're going to need to be aware of some of these differences before you decide whether you want to join us or not. Regardless, we will continue doing these online formats. We will continue to be uploading things to YouTube, and we'll have things live on Sabbath mornings from here on out. And so not much has changed on that front, but for those who are willing and able, they might be able to join us starting on July 4th. Once again, as we continue to navigate this reopening, as we continue to navigate these times together, we always ask for any support that you might be willing to offer for us through tithe or through offering, through your donations. We want to thank you for everything that you do as a way of being stewards of God's work here through us. Continue to pray for us as we continue to pray for you. May you have a blessed Sabbath. Things are starting to get heated here between Job and his friends. Tempers are starting to rise and arguments are kind of increasing. The tone of their voices are probably getting a little bit louder as they debate with each other where Job's place is in all of this. If you remember from last week, we spoke about a tale of two methods, two ways of doing theology. Theology being that practice of faith seeking understanding. That moment when we put our heads into trying to understand and discern the ways of God. That is the way of theology, right? Faith seeking understanding. And last week we described two methods in which we could do theology. One that starts from an abstract and then comes down to a concrete reality. One largely devoid of experience. Or there's another method, one that grows out of mutual experience, mutual growing together, as a journeying with people together to come to a larger abstract view. If you remember from last week, Job's cry for his friends is for them to listen to him. That Job's friends have been giving him their theology right off the bat. That Job's questions, his frustrations, his not knowing why he's in this position has been answered by Job's friends with quick answers to their theology that they've kind of grown up with. Theology that they've heard all along, this sort of solidified and concrete theology that they've heard before. And in doing so, they're kind of drowning out Job's voice in this process. They're drowning out Job's experience at this moment. Their theology tells them that those who suffer pain, affliction, disease, are all because of their sin. And that the right course of action at this point is to become righteous, to acknowledge your sin, to repent from your sin, and then God will then give back all that is due for Job. But Job says he rejects that theology, and he says, but I've been innocent. I'm an innocent person. Sure, I'm not perfect, but my sins do not warrant this sort of burden that has been laid upon me. And so in this way, Job's experience doesn't quite make sense with his friend's theology, and he's pushing against this theology. Largely, that has a lot of roots in the book of Proverbs. And this week we see Job and his friends again debating. Their arguments are getting a little bit more intense. They're getting a little bit more heated. And more than anything, they're becoming a little bit more pointed at each other. As they debate, their conversations continue to grow. The movement, it's moving forward at different paces. But it's at this moment where Job's experience will enlarge his vantage point from which he will show the weaknesses of his friend's theology. He's going to expose the weaknesses to their arguments. And he's going to begin by looking at chapter 21, verses 6. When I think about what I am saying, I shudder. My body trembles. Why do the wicked prosper, growing old and powerful? They live to see their children grow up and settle down, and they enjoy their grandchildren. Their homes are safe from every fear, and God does not punish them. Verse 13, they spend their days in prosperity, then go down to the grave in peace. And yet they say to God, go away, we want no part of you and your ways. Who is the Almighty, and why should we obey him? What good will it do us to pray? Verse 17. Yet the light of the wicked never seems to be extinguished. Do they ever have trouble? Does God distribute sorrows to them in anger? This is Job's response to his friends. This is him pointing the holes in their arguments. He's saying the wicked, they prosper on this earth. You see them prosper. They grow old with their children. They have possessions that they bring together. And Job says, why do they prosper still? Don't you see that, my friends? He says, they get to grow old and enjoy their grandchildren. In verse 9, he says, their homes are safe from fear, and God does not punish them. He said, friends, this thing that you're pointing out, you're saying that I'm wicked, that I deserve this because I've sinned, but this doesn't make sense when you see all around us that the wicked prosper in ways that I have not prospered, or that you have not prospered, that we as good people have not prospered in the same ways that they have. Your theology, he says, doesn't quite make sense of all of these things. And as part of this, the conversation between Job and his friends is going to shift. And they're going to shift their focus in a way that provides Job a vantage point for his experience. He's actually going to shift the conversation between he and his friends to a conversation about the poor. All in all, Job is asking, why aren't the wicked punished? He says in chapter 24, verses 2 through 14, evil people steal land by moving the boundary markers. They steal livestock and put them in their own pastures. They take the orphan's donkey and demand the widow's ox as security for a loan. The poor are pushed off the path. The needy must hide together for safety, like wild donkeys in the wilderness. The poor must spend all their time looking for food, searching even in the desert for food for their children. They harvest a field they do not own, and they glean in the vineyards of the wicked. All night they lie naked in the cold without clothing or covering. They are soaked by mountain showers, and they huddle against the rocks for want of a home. The wicked snatch a widow's child from her breast, taking the baby as security for a loan. The poor must go about naked without any clothing. They harvest food for others while they themselves are starving. They press out olive oil without being allowed to taste it, and they tread in the winepress as they suffer from thirst. The groans of the dying rise from the city, and the wounded cry for help, yet God ignores their moaning. Wicked people rebel against the light. They refuse to acknowledge its ways or stay in its paths. The murderer rises in the early dawn to kill the poor and needy. At night, he is a thief. It's through this conversation that Job realizes that his situation is that of like the poor. He realizes that his vantage point, this is where his vantage point now turns from himself, and he looks around through this conversation with his friends, and he realizes that the poor are also under a great burden of senselessness, senseless violence and injustice. And it leads Job to ask, where then is God in the midst of all of this? Will God be deaf to the cries of the poor? This is the bridge for Job. He sees the connection here so vividly that his life now, where he stands today, is now not different from the life of the poor. He now sees them in a different light. He now, having experienced this place, he has a different perspective. And in all of this, he realizes that his suffering is just like theirs, and his questions still are at the forefront of his conversations. Is how do we speak of God now? Where is God in the midst of all of this? Is God deaf to the cries of the poor? He said, it seems like the wicked prosper, and the poor, they just simply do not. They're abused and misused. In all of this, Zophar, one of Job's friends, he kind of understands where Job is coming from. And you see Zophar's response in chapter 20 here. Chapter 20, verse 15 to 21, he says, they will vomit the wealth they swallowed. God won't let them keep it down. They will suck the poison of cobras. The viper will kill them. They will never again enjoy streams of olive oil or rivers of milk and honey. They will give back everything they worked for. Their wealth will bring them no joy. For they oppressed the poor and left them destitute. They foreclosed on their homes. They were always greedy and never satisfied. Nothing remains of all the things that they dreamt about. Nothing is left after they finish gorging themselves. Zophar kind of gets it. He produces this sort of response to the wickedness of man. And it's at this point that Job kind of calls his friends to the task. In verse 34 of chapter 21, he says, how can your empty cliches comfort me? All your explanations are lies, Job says. Zophar kind of gets it, but Eliphaz often just continues to go back to that sort of cliche response that he likes to give Job. He turns back to his theology and he says that, well, this experience doesn't quite fit into our theology, but our theology has stood the test of time, and so our theology is that what we have learned, and this is where we need to hold our ground. But Job says, your proverbs, they're empty cliches, and how might they comfort me? It's at this point that Eliphaz gets even more heated. He gets a little bit more angry with Job. And he gives Job another response in chapter 22, verse 4. He says, is it because you're so pious that he accuses you and brings judgment against you? No, it's because of your wickedness. There's no limit to your sins, he tells Job. For example, you must have lent money to your friend and demanded clothing as security. Yes, you stripped him to the bone. You must have refused water for the thirsty and food for the hungry. You probably think the land belongs to the powerful and only the privileged have a right to it. You must have sent widows away empty-handed and crushed the hopes of orphans. That is why you are surrounded by traps and tremble from sudden fears, Job. That is why you cannot see in the darkness and waves of water cover you. Eliphaz is pointing his argument now directly at Job's actions. Job has long since already tried to prove his innocence. He said that he's been a righteous man all along with integrity. Now Job brings up the point about the poor, and he wants to talk about, and he's now relating with the poor. And Eliphaz, probably the smartest of the three of his friends, it clicks for him, and he says, that's it, Job. That's exactly what it is. He continues in verse 21, he says, submit to God and you will have peace, then things will go well for you. What he just did in this earlier part of the chapter, he says, this is the problem, Job. You've neglected the poor. You've thought that you were this high and righteous man, but you've probably neglected the poor, and this is why these things are happening to you. Eliphaz, his argument shifts a little bit, and now his claim for Job is that he is at fault for being one of those wicked people that abuses and misuses others. And he tells Job, submit to God and you will have peace, and then things will go well for you. Listen to his instructions and store them in your heart. If you return to the Almighty, you will be restored, so clean up your life. If you give up your lust for money and throw your precious gold into the river, the Almighty himself will be your treasure. He will be your precious silver. Then you will take delight in the Almighty and look up to God. You will pray to him and he will hear you. You will fulfill your vows to him. You will succeed in whatever you choose to do, and light will shine on the road ahead of you. If people are in trouble and you say, help them, God will save them. Even sinners will be rescued. They will be rescued because your hands are pure. Do you see what's happening here? Job's friends, they just continue to lay the groundwork for an assault on Job. Always claiming that he has to be at fault for what has befallen him. Their argument, if you follow the text closely, and unfortunately we're not reading every text line by line. I'm kind of grabbing texts here and there to give the essence of the story. But if you follow their arguments closely, they just keep going back and forth, holding steadfast to their theology. And Job continues to defend himself against his friends. He continues to say that he is innocent of the things that they are claiming of him. His friends still fail to listen to Job's explanations here. They still fail to see what's right before their very eyes. They've become closed off by their theology. In this newest rendition of their debate, they choose to decide to believe that Job must have been wicked towards the poor. They said, Job, you bring up a good point about poor people. You bring up a good point about the plight of the poor. We see how you're connecting and making that bridge between your life and theirs. But that must only be so because you must have neglected them. You must have been part of the problem. How quick they are to judge Job. And it angers Job because he realizes that that's not him. He will soon defend himself and say that he is the father of those who are afflicted. In his final speech in this section of the story, he starts off by saying in chapter 27, verse 2, I vow by the living God who has taken away my rights, by the Almighty who has embittered my soul, as long as I live, while I have breath from God, my lips will speak no evil, and my tongue will speak no lies. I will never concede that you are right. I will defend my integrity until I die. I will maintain my innocence without wavering. My conscience is clear for as long as I live. May my enemy be punished like the wicked, my adversary like those who do evil. Job here is angry. He's defended himself. He's defended his position. He's defended his relationship with the poor, the oppressed, those who are in a place of poverty, those who are under the burden of injustice. Job finds himself in the same place as he's trying to make sense of the things that have happened to him. Because remember, one of the things at stake here is the justice of God for Job. One of the biggest things that he questions, and this is where he's wrestling, is there justice in God's world? In the realm of God, does God pursue justice? This is a question for Job because he's encountered his pain, he's encountered his affliction, and he's not so sure anymore about God's righteousness. And in all of this, he's again debating with his friends, and all of these things are coming up. But the author, he's like the author of Job, the poetic genius that the author is, will see to it that the legitimate longing from Job to answer these questions will not remain rudimentary or unmediated. It's at this point when Job is kind of diving into these questions, wrestling with God at this point, he must mature, and the questions must penetrate us more deeply at this point. And they have to take a historical form for us. What I'm getting at is that the questions that Job is posing for us, the questions that are on the table here today, they cannot be handled by what Blaise Pascal calls the mathematical mind. The mathematical mind which reasons in an orderly way from definitions and principles. To get at the heart of these questions, to get at the heart of the matter for Job, what is needed is what he calls an intuitive mind, which is capable of penetrating a comprehensive vision of reality that is accessible to all. And the author of Job is trying to do this through these conversations, through these dialogues with his friends, as we see his friends kind of stubborn and dogged in their theology, and Job in his experience trying to reason and make sense of God at this moment. The questions that are before us will require wisdom. And the author of Job helps us in developing this vision of wisdom by giving us this beautiful poem on wisdom and putting us in the presence of the greatness of God and the hidden understanding of God's intentions for the human race. You see this poem here in chapter 28 of the book of Job. And I want to read the chapter in its entirety with you, and I want you to appreciate what Job is trying to do here. Again, we're trying to get at the intuitive mind of the matter, seeing and comprehending the vast vision that Job is presenting for us this morning. The author writes, "People know where to mine silver and how to refine gold. They know where to dig iron from the earth and how to smelt copper from rock. They know how to shine light in the darkness and explore the farthest regions of the earth as they search in the dark for ore. They sink a mine shaft into the earth far from where anyone lives. They descend on ropes, swinging back and forth. Food is grown on the earth above, but down below the earth is melted as by fire. Here the rocks contain precious lapis lazuli, and the dust contains gold. These are treasures no bird of prey can see, no falcon's eye observe. No wild animal has walked upon these treasures. No lion has ever set his paw there. People know how to tear apart flinty rocks and overturn the roots of mountains. They cut tunnels in the rocks and uncover precious stones. They dam up trickling streams and bring to light hidden treasures. But do people know where to find wisdom? Where can they find understanding? No one knows where to find it, for it is not found among the living. It is not here, says the ocean, nor is it here, says the sea. It cannot be bought with gold. It cannot be purchased with silver. It's worth more than all the gold of Ophir, greater than the precious onyx or lapis lazuli. Wisdom is more valuable than gold and crystal. It cannot be purchased with jewels mounted in fine gold. Coral and jasper are worthless in trying to get it. The price of wisdom is far above rubies. Precious peridot from Ethiopia cannot be exchanged from it. It's worth more than the purest gold. But do people know where to find wisdom? Where can they find understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all humanity. Even the sharp-eyed birds in the sky cannot discover it. Destruction and death say we've heard only rumors of where wisdom can be found. God alone understands the way to wisdom. He knows where it can be found, for he looks throughout the whole earth and sees everything under the heavens. He decided how hard the wind should blow and how much rain should fall. He made the laws for the rain and laid out a path for the lightning. Then he saw wisdom and evaluated it. He set it in place and examined it thoroughly. And this is what he says to all humanity: the fear of the Lord is true wisdom. To forsake evil is real understanding. In verses of great beauty, the author reminds us here that the quest on which Job is on requires a level of discernment that only wisdom gives. Last week we concluded with this position of needing to be better listeners, that our call as Christians in a world of pain and suffering is to be good, attentive listeners. Listeners to the pain and to the struggle of our neighbors. Now this week, Job includes another dimension. His vision has been enlarged. He says now to take notice of those who are poor and oppressed, those who face injustice. He says, take notice of them. This is all adding and culminating to these great, grand questions that Job has about God. And this week, we realize that we need to continue on this journey of speaking of God rightly. That is the journey that we're on with this series of Job, how we can speak of God rightly as Job did. We need the possession of wisdom. And for Job, what he reveals for us in this chapter, in this section this week, is that the possession of wisdom is identical with fear of the Lord. He tells us in this poem that human beings know where we find silver, iron, and great many other things. He's listing this high achievement of humanity. But he says, but where wisdom is concerned, he says, God alone understands her path and knows where she is to be found. At the same time, the author here is showing us that in a subtle way, there's something new is needed if we are to share in the knowledge of God. Chapter 28 here is the hinge. It's kind of the moment where this book begins to pivot. The debates with his friends have shown us the weight of Job's questions, the weight of Job's struggle, where Job is at this point, how he relates now with the suffering of those in the world. And now this chapter, the poetic hinge that is needed in the development of this book, serves to shift our focus from the mathematical mind, from the rational mind, from our need to make sense of everything with facts, figures, and logic. He's saying there's something different that we need to make sense of this. That this work of faith, this work of discipleship, this calling for Christianity, it also requires an intuitive mind that sees the grand vision of all of these things, that connects the different spheres of life. Because it's through connecting all of these things, through seeing all of these things, that we can get now this grand perspective that Job has now. And he realizes that now what's needed more than ever is this wisdom that only the fear of the Lord brings. And so as we continue to journey with the book of Job, as we continue to discover what this fear of the Lord might look like, I pray for you this week that we may once again be better listeners and more attentive, more in tune to the needs of others. More in tune to their questions, to their desires, to their misunderstandings. And that from that moment, from listening, then we can begin to discern through the wisdom of God what a proper speak of God, what proper talk of God might entail. We have a couple more conversations to be had before we conclude the book of Job with God's appearance. God speaks at the end of the book of Job. But before we get there, we need to develop a few more of these points together. May we be better listeners, and may we seek God's wisdom through a relationship with Him. May that be our daily struggle. May that be the point upon which we rest. Amen.